today we have Michel Negroponte. This is part 2 of an exciting interview that we have with this fabulous filmmaker. Welcome again.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
We were happy to have you in part 1 of this interview. Just for the audience, we basically were talking about a series of films that Mr. Negroponte has done about the heroin epidemic and recovery from heroin, and also his journey to, I guess, explore the worlds of outsiders.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a body of work that I've made over the last 30 years, actually a little longer than that. And so, I'm fairly seasoned, and I've certainly made a number of films, and I've also produced a number of films with younger filmmakers. It's what I do.
Absolutely, and definitely, just to bring everybody up to speed, his work has been, his work has won awards at Sundance. It's been on HBO. They have been viewed on PBS. He's been a professor at NYU. I know that he's taught at Temple University. So we're very happy to have him back. Did I?
Yeah,
skip
no, and
anything?
I'm currently teaching at the Vermont College of Fine Arts, which is an
Fantastic.
MFA program, which is actually, of all the places I've ever taught, my favorite. But that's another issue.
Okay. So, you know, I talked a little bit in the first episode about Silver Valley. We did not touch on the autobiography of
Michelle Maren.
Michelle Maren.
Well, that's interesting because we talked a little bit about Jupiter's Wife, which is a
Right,
film that I
right,
made
right.
finished in 1995.
Right.
And then in an unusual way, that film came back to me. An Autobiography of Michelle Maren is a film that I finished in 2015, and I actually started it, it took about 4 years to make. And it actually, it has references to a film that I made in the 1990s called Jupiter's Wife. And the reason there is a connection is that one day I got an email from a woman named Michelle Maren, and she said that she'd seen my film Jupiter's Wife 80 times, and she wondered if I might be interested in her story. And Michelle Maren had worked in the sex industry. She had a host of mental illness issues that she had been struggling with for a long period of time. And after a fairly long period of just talking to her about the possibility of making a film, we decided to collaborate. That was one of the ideas that I had, is that she would co-direct the film with me. And she actually photographs herself, she videotapes herself for almost the first third of the film. So that's how that project started.
I thought it was kind of interesting. Somebody who was not formally trained in filmmaking, she was really into it in terms of setting up the shots, like opening her refrigerator or just positioning the camera in such a way and practicing the shots over and over.
No, it's true. It's absolutely true. She was so inventive. She was a movie buff. A really, really committed movie buff, and knew Hollywood films in particular inside out. And, she had been a movie star. Unfortunately, it was pornographic films, but, I think she knew something about this world both directly and indirectly. And the way in which she, photographed herself, videotaped herself, was amazing to me. I was really engaged. And that certainly is where this project started. And you've seen the entire film. It's a very intense journey that begins, like many of my other projects, in one place, and I had no idea where it was going to end. And frankly, it ended very badly.
Can you elaborate, where did it go sideways?
Well, the way I've always thought about the film is that There are three acts. The first third of the film is Michelle Maren, in effect, making a film about herself. It's her autobiography. The middle section of the film, we go back to her past, back to her childhood, and we visit her childhood home, and we also sort of look at the places that she had been talking about and referring to in the first part of the film. And she'd had a very, very brutal childhood. I mean, she lived in she had an abusive mother, and her father had abandoned her, and by the time she was 17, she ran away from home and ended up Times Square, and it was sort of a sad descent after that into the sex industry. So the second part of the film is a film that is the section of the film that we collaborated on, in effect. And the third part of the film is sort of my turn to take over. I literally at one point come from around the camera, as you know, and I sort of take over in a sense. And I think this is really a movie about a woman with a personality disorder, a clinical personality disorder, and that has caused havoc in her life. And in addition, there's a lot of trauma in her life. I think what happens in the third act is that I really kind of confront her about a few things that I've learned, and it really causes a major fracture in our relationship, and in a way we never recovered. I mean,
I watched that footage where there's a confrontation at the grave site, and it's really odd because I actually agreed with you in terms of the dispute, in terms of whether she was being sincere or whether she was staging. And it really, in that movie, I felt like what I was seeing the whole time was her filming her inner child, her wounded child. Because I didn't feel like I was watching an adult. I felt it was a little bit of arrested development, watching her teenage or pre-adolescent self who had been put down by her mother.
yeah.
I felt like I was watching that. There was two people on camera. One was grown-up Michelle, and one was the little girl, the wounded child.
Oh, I think definitely. I mean, that's a part, I think it's an aspect of her life that she has struggled to reconcile. Nonetheless, I think it's also, Joan Didion said, the writer Joan Didion said something I think really remarkable. She said, "We tell ourselves stories in order to survive." And at first glance, that sounds like a simple statement, but she says we tell ourselves stories. In other words, we have to create a sense of self based on our own personal histories that we can live with and allow, and somehow we come to terms with ourselves so that we can move forward. So I think that in a way, she presents herself on screen in a way that she sees herself and that she wants to believe that she actually is. So it's a very, very complicated portrait of a woman who almost seems to have, multiple personalities.
I think the thing about being an abused child is that there's the you who you would have been organically if you had not been abused, and then there's the you that's a result of the abuse. So there's the shiny, beautiful diamond, but then there's also the other you that's really, really messed up and wounded. And maybe both are true. Maybe the woman with the hair and the lipstick.
I think they're all true, and they're all very real. That's the part that makes it so complicated. And the truth is, I mean, there's a book that was written about borderline, and the title of it is "I Hate You, but Please Don't Leave Me." And that conflict between sort of love and hate, that you can project both love and hate on the same person, and almost mean exactly the same thing. I think it's incredibly disorienting, and I found the experience disorienting. So I think by the third act of the film, which is called An Autobiography of Michelle Maren, you get this sense of my own disorientation, and that's what leads to the confrontation.
I was surprised that you were willing to stick with like not let her off the hook. Like it would have been easy to just like you know to just humor her, but
At the end of the film?
yeah, you could have easily humored
Well,
her, but you decided to like stick with it. No, trying to figure out whether she was being authentic or honest or not.
well, it's so difficult because
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think it also has to do with clinical personality disorders. I think there are a number of realities and they all carry the same weight in her head.
Yeah.
And, I didn't enter into this project to challenge, her own perceptions. I mean, it was a very difficult and frustrating film. It was by far the most difficult film I've ever made. And I wish it had ended differently, but I think it really does give people a sense of of um, of personality disorders and how complex they are. And narcissism is a clinical personality disorder, and there is definitely an incredibly narcissistic aspect to Michelle Maren, and I would say it's part of her survival. Her
Absolutely.
survival
Absolutely.
mechanism.
There's a strange comparison that I'm going to make, and I'm not sure it might be way off, but Michelle Maren, that documentary and the documentary you're working on now, My Autonomous Neighbor, Fred Tate
Billings.
Billings, forgive me, but I see a little bit of Michelle, that lonely child, in him.
Well, Tate, the subject of My Autonomous Neighbor, is definitely an outsider. He's an outsider artist, and he's lived alone for most of his life in this ramshackle house in Sullivan County. I got to know him because my wife and I have a place in the Catskills. And there are a number of things that struck me immediately and when I first met him. And he's exceptionally bright. He lives inside his head. He has I think that might be the common ground. We're talking about people who live inside their heads, and I think they live inside their heads in a way that is incredibly real and visceral to them. It's a very active and wonderful place. The thing that is sometimes difficult for someone like me in terms of trying to develop a friendship with Michelle Maren and to a certain extent with Tate is how do I get inside that person's head? I think, I think there might be an element of, uh, of self-protection, you
Well,
know?
he seems to have kind of a lot of underdeveloped social relationships, like living in his truck for all those like
18 years,
18 years in the freezing cold,
living in a truck.
even though he had the financial means.
Yeah.
You showed a lot of early childhood photographs. I just saw a little bit of immaturity with him
Well,
walking around with the butterfly on his back. He has seemed like a young soul, like, arrested
well,
in some way.
Tate also is an incredibly complex human being. I mean, he is one of the brightest people I have ever met. I mean, he has an encyclopedic knowledge about more subject matters than you and I could ever
Yeah, but
dream
that
of.
could be a cover though.
Well, I mean, I don't. Well, he's bright. I think it has interfered. I think with his ability to sort of function in the real world because I think he prefers his own world.
Is there a little bit of autism there, you think, in the spectrum, you think?
You know, I don't know if he's on the spectrum or not. You know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist. I like Tate immensely, and he's a lot of fun to hang out with, and he's a really creative soul. He can be very difficult, and I think you see it in the film that he has almost like a temper tantrum with me at one point. He can be childlike, and you know, I've learned, because I'm fairly seasoned at this, to say, Tate, calm down, everything is going to be okay, let's move forward.
Well, you know, I want to give the viewers a peek at the trailer for My Autonomous Neighbor, and maybe they can draw some conclusions. He's a wonderful man, incredible artist. Here's the trailer.
And now I'm going to do another one of these spiraling wormholes from hell thing and see where that goes. I think what I'm doing is I'm excavating the lower levels of the Bardo plain. The universe wants to understand itself. It creates people like us who can have the brains to make the equations and the interpretations of reality in order to be able to explain this stuff at all. So it's not like it's a meaningless universe. It's a universe that wants to understand itself. Otherwise, it wouldn't create us. That's part of the challenge of the universe. If we knew everything had meaning, that would kind of take the fun out of it. I mean, you have to create meaning. You have to fight for it.
That was a trailer from My Autonomous Neighbor. I have to tell you, the visual effects were just unbelievable.
Thank you.
I know we were talking about, you know, Tate's personality, but I have to tell you, I mean, I want to talk about Tate, but there's the other layer of this filmmaking, the visuals. That's another subject I want to get into.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. When I start a project, and as I said earlier, I don't really have any idea where I'm going. And I start shooting, and I also start editing almost immediately. And I begin to sort of develop this dialogue, you know, with the process of making the film. And I've learned to be very patient and just allow myself to sort of allow it to develop. And at one point, very early on in the process of making this film, I had this idea that sort of popped into my head, and it was simply, I'm going to make a collage film about a collage artist. And there was something so neat about the idea, and I didn't really know if it was possible, but the aesthetic challenge or the creative challenge certainly inspired me.
You know, talking about this film, you know, it reminds me, we've talked about a number of your films, but I didn't really mention the fact that in most of your films, there is that visual element where you're seeing somebody almost creating painterly images.
Yeah, well,
That's very true in Dangerously with Love.
yeah.
It's very much true with Macedonia. And so in one of the things about seeing films by Negroponte is that you're basically seeing visual art as well.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you.
No,
You know,
absolutely.
look, when I remember when I was a teenager and I started to look at movies seriously. I mean, serious films. I mean, Renoir, Ozu, Bresson, Godard, Truffaut. I mean, the masters of 20th century cinema. And I was absolutely engaged by the stories, the characters that they were developing in their stories, but I was also fascinated with the filmmaking. And it's a craft. And you're a painter. You cannot separate the visual storytelling from the craft. And so that's why I actually photograph and edit my own work. I don't produce films. I make films.
Right.
And I work alone for the most part. Well, I do have some very important collaborators, like my autonomous neighbor, a student of mine worked on the motion graphics with me, and he had a profound effect on the film. Nonetheless, I author these films, I create these films. And the visual and cinematic elements of the story, of the filmmaking, are very, very important to me. I mean, one of the things that I say to people, to students, is that in documentary filmmaking today, there's very little filmmaking. And I believe that. I mean, I really don't think that currently that most documentary filmmakers pay enough attention to the filmmaking. You can create an entire emotional subtext to the story if you understand the cinematic language, if you know how to edit, if you know how to photograph, and you photograph the film and know really how to use these elements in the filmmaking and in the storytelling. And for me, that is really important.
Definitely in my autonomous neighbor. First of all, my favorite part of his work is actually I like his line drawings with just the two pencils. Actually, before he actually erases anything or sticks anything on it, I actually just like the lines. That's my favorite part of his work. But I was shocked when you told me. I assumed that you had, gotten some graphic guy to do the flying saucer or put the footage in from the 1950s Martian movies. There's so many little things going on. The green screened. I'm not.
At the end of the film.
I was surprised when you told me that you're the one who.
Well, I mean, I worked with a motion graphics person on this stuff, and he certainly had a lot of ideas that contributed to the final look and feel of the film. But nonetheless, when I started, I did kind of a first version of it myself without motion graphics, just with very crude sort of superimpositions or using sections of old films, because really right from the beginning I had this idea that I was going to introduce Tate as somebody who had landed from outer space. It's very much part of his vocabulary, and he makes many references to sci-fi and science. So I introduced Tate in the movie as an alien from outer space, and there are lots of references to sci-fi movies. And then by the end of the movie, he lands on Earth. And he tells this story about how his own family ridiculed him when he was a child, and that he felt like an outsider. And so
I love the part when he's putting period costumes on and taking pictures of himself with the sword. But I also like the last clip in the film where he's actually in character as someone from outer space. That's my favorite part of the film.
Well, after his sister died, which is described at the end of the film, he was really very distraught, and in ways that I think even surprised him. And, I knew that I could not end the film on that note. And, Tate says something that is so powerful. You know, he said, the universe wants to understand itself, and we also, as humans, want to create meaning for ourselves. And so I decided to create this ending for him where I send him to Mars. And that's the end of the film. We used all these sort of fairly sophisticated techniques, but I felt like I wanted to give him a gift. And that was part of the film. You know, I think a filmmaker should be able to give his subject or her subject a gift. So I gave him this marvelous, beautiful, surreal ending. And I sent Tate to Mars in a sci-fi film that we invented.
What was Tate's response to viewing this documentary?
Well, it's quite funny. The first time he saw the film, he said, I think it's a little too traditional, which I thought was quite funny. Because there's really nothing traditional about it at all. I mean, it's, but you know, I think now he's seen it several times. It's very funny. Every time he sees the film, he says, well, this is the first time I've ever seen it. And I said, no, Tate, you saw it already. But he thinks he's seen it for the first time. And the last time he saw it was at a screening we did in Callicoon, in upstate New York, in a movie theater, as part of an art walk, the Callicoon Art Walk. And you know, he's beginning to see things that he hadn't seen before. It is a collage. It's very dense, the film, and I think the more he sees it, the more he appreciates it. I
can't even imagine Tate surviving a career in the armed forces. I just cannot. I mean, we just have 2 minutes left, but if you could just respond to that.
Well, he worked for, I believe it was 22 or 23 years, in the National Guard. It was a full-time job. I think he left with the rank of sergeant, but he was primarily doing electronics, and he was doing the kind of work that he was very well suited to do. I mean, he went through basic training, and he did all of that. Nonetheless, most of the work he did was electronics and working with more sophisticated electronic equipment, and that suited him very well. And he also said that he found a lot of time to do his own work.
So just before we have 1 more minute, before we end the show, if you could just tell the audience where they can see this amazing movie, My Autonomous Neighbor.
We're doing the festival circuit right now. We do not have a New York venue lined up yet. I hope to have one soon. So by the time this is aired, maybe it will be playing in New York in a film festival. And then we're talking to some distributors about maybe streaming the film, but that's still in the works. This is part of the negotiation of getting the film out into the world.
So I'm going to put in the credits the website, myautonomousneighbor.com. So if you'd like to see this, at least a trailer, definitely go to the website. Thank you so much.
We'll update any information on that website for the film.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'ma show you how to party.